Good morning, and my compliments and greetings to Philip. Like Sally Katzen at the last panel, I'm going to be a bit of a skunk and a little bit of a devil's advocate, and I'm not sure whether it's appropriate to have that at the very beginning of the panel, but nevertheless, I'll try to lay down some challenges. In Philip's book, we have this wonderful, glowing proposal. This is about the third page of the introduction. Under this new governing philosophy, that's the set of proposals that Philip is setting out, people are empowered to take into account all the circumstances. Instead of uniformity, it encourages local differences. Instead of aspiring to avoid disagreement with clear rules set out in advance, it encourages argument over what's right. Instead of legal entitlements, it aspires to balance different interests. Instead of requiring objective proof, it allows people to make judgments based on their perceptions and their values. Instead of judging people by legalistic compliance, it judges them by the results they achieve and their good faith. Terrific vision, and it's fully articulated in the rest of the book. And one's inclined to say, who could possibly disagree with that? Who could possibly dissent? Why would anybody disagree? Here's why. And I'm going to mention 5 or 6 propositions that we need to think about. First of all, they're mostly about the issues that present themselves for regulation, the domains of questions, the domains of activity that present themselves for regulation. In many of them, in a country this size, populated by more than 250 million of highly opinionated, angry individuals, many of whom are on drugs, in a community of this size and a continent of this size and diversity, the solution to many of the problems that have to be dealt with is going to be counterintuitive. And just having people rely on common sense is going to be a problem because of the scale and technicality of what needs to be dealt with. You can't do air traffic control just based on common sense. To use another of Sally's examples, you can't do the safeguarding of the meat supply or the food supply generally just based on common sense. These are technical issues and they require great technical specification. So any solution that we propose has to meet that challenge of counterintuitive technical modes of decision. And even in the areas where there are intuitions, and intuitions are relevant at various stages in dealing with the issues that we face, we know that people's intuitions differ. I've spent a lot of my career writing about disagreement. I had a book called Law and Disagreement, trying to convey to my colleagues that when they talk about justice, they're talking about an area where people disagree about justice. Disagree as a matter of principle, not just disagreeing as a matter of interest, although both types of divergence are tremendously important. People disagree about values and priorities, so that your common sense is not necessarily my common sense. Now, Philip doesn't disagree with that. He says we have to argue this out, and people have to be willing to take responsibility for acting on their own values and priorities. But we do have to understand that people bring multiple values and principles to the decisions that their society faces, and that people are stakeholders of multiple kinds come to the issues that the society faces. When Nicole Gelinas spoke about opposition to pedestrianization, she talked about it as bureaucratic opposition, but in the next breath she explained that this was the opposition of multiple stakeholders, drivers, businesses, and so on. That wasn't bureaucratic opposition, that was an attempt to try to find a way to integrate these multiple arrays of stakeholders. And some stakeholders in their protests and their objections and their proposals are more legitimate than others. And again, that's a matter of an assessment of the kinds of stakeholders we're dealing with. So any decent decisional process has to deal with that, and simply saying, well, someone must take responsibility won't be enough. Many of the issues that need to be faced are complex, and we're talking really, really complex. The complexity that requires articulation, that is the breaking down of a given decision into 100 or 1,000 component decisions with input from 100 or 1,000 different directions. And don't just think of the small cog in the machine type bureaucrat, but we need one group of scientists to work on this aspect, And we need another group of scientists, specialists, so not the first group, to work on the other impact, and their results, their decisions about the supervision of a food supply chain or the management of a large river, those scientific inputs need to be brought into relation with one another. That's why God invented process. Yeah? We break a decision down step by step into its component parts, and we require some mechanism, decisional mechanism, that brings one set of decisions into another set of decisions. We need, in the midst of all this, predictability, calculability of results. When Weber spoke about the advantages of bureaucracy, it was calculability above all that he had in mind, and that's sometimes related to the use of rules rather than standards. We use rules rather than standards and principles when we are less worried by the mistakes of over and under inclusiveness with rules than we are worried by the mistakes of judgment and discretion in the case of standards. But somebody has to make that decision. And even if we are using standards and principles, we have to find processes that will relate one set of standards and principles to another set of standards and principles, because these are very, very seldom decisions that can simply be made in a Solomonic fashion of cutting through all the detail. Because people disagree, and because this is a large, large country, a decision made about one bridge or about one form of lettuce in the food supply chain will be repeated all over the country, and necessarily there will be different common senses at work on that. And we face issues about impartiality and even-handedness that need to be addressed and can only be addressed, I think, by something like a bureaucratically organized apparatus. You see what I'm trying to do? It's not just small people taking micro decisions, it's people taking component decisions and relating those into some predictable array. And then finally, we have to consider the temptations associated with the model that Philip has in mind. The wonderful marquee example he uses is the elevation of the deck of the Bayonne Bridge and the ludicrous requirement that there be an environmental impact report on that. He says, why did you need 5-year environmental study when the environmental impact was minimal or close to minimal? Yeah, sure. Why? But the next construction problem comes along and there's a slightly higher possibility of environmental impact, but somebody will want to take advantage of that first exemption, pressure the person who was empowered to make the exemption and to cut through or dismiss the need for an environmental impact. There will be firms and businesses who will set up offices whose job it is to lobby for this sort of assessment, and eventually somebody is going to have to take responsibility for determining, presumably on objective grounds and presumably on complex grounds, when such waivers are possible. So you just land yourself with a different kind of bureaucratic process. I'm not with Sally Katz, and I don't want to get rid of the notion of bureaucracy. I want us to embrace a vision of bureaucracy that involves the integration of the multiple steps and decision points in a rational process that deals with counterintuitive technical problems. Thank you very much indeed.